I'll call this meeting to order. And I'll do a attendance. Tom Burkle, I don't see him. Charlie,
Here.
Marie. I know she's here. She has no voice. Michael,
Here.
Colin Smith,
Here.
Patrick White,
Here.
and don't see Don Colburn, but so we're waiting for Christine to see if she can get the video going.
Well, we can get going, Nadine. I don't think, I mean, a lot of this is going to be Matt, I think sharing some of the
Okay,
additional analysis. So there'll be slides as long as he can present. We can get rolling.
all right, very good. We're gonna table approval of minutes. They haven't quite been finished yet. We haven't had a chance to finish proofing them. So we'll postpone those to the next meeting. And then we're on to discussion and presented methodologies with additional projection analysis. So Jake and Matt.
Yeah,
before-
I'm going to turn it over to Matt in just a second. I just wanted to let you know that we have on the agenda today to sort of scan the methodologies that we've presented to date. And then we were asked at the last meeting to do our best to attempt some projections forward. So I've asked Matt not to spend a lot of time, in the weeds with the methodologies we've spent a lot of time going through, but just to scan through them. And then if there are particular questions that members have that they'd like us Matt to talk a little bit more about a particular methodology, he's glad to do that. And then when we move to projections, he's going to make a caveat, but I'm going to make a caveat too right now, is that we've been looking at enrollment numbers, foundation enrollment numbers, methodologies that both NESDEC, Berkshire Regional Planning Commission, and some others, UMass Donahue, have used to project enrollment forward. It is, as I've said when I did my enrollment report about a year ago, it's an imperfect science. So we're using those sort of an aggregation of those enrollment methodologies to do our best to project forward. The challenge with some of those projections is that those projections are done at the district level. And so they take into account patterns of choice and tuition, when what we really want to know in terms of assessment is what are the patterns of enrollment at the town level in terms of kids who live in the town, because that really is what constitutes foundation enrollment, which will drive, either a foundation enrollment methodology or a required local contribution, minimum local contribution. So I'm putting a caveat early about projections. Matt set some spreadsheets up that we reviewed that can be toggled to work on, to sort of massage those assumptions. So I certainly leave it open to the committee, the subcommittee, if you have any thoughts around adjusting any of the ways that we're thinking about projections. It's certainly easily done. So with that said, Nadine, as a setup, I'm going to pass it over to Matt to just scan the methodologies and then open it up to questions, because I think what you wanted to do today was then discuss where the committee is leaning on particular methodologies.
Yes, thank you.
Excuse me, Jake.
Yes.
So I just checked. It is showing that the video is supposed to be on. What I did is I toggled it on and off. Oh,
Yeah.
You just showed up.
I'm on now. So people, if they want to come on, can.
I toggled it on. It was on, so I don't know if it has something to do with the update, but
Yeah, mine's still not working.
Yeah,
Yeah,
mine's
neither's
still
mine.
not working either.
the only thing I would recommend is logging off and logging back on.
Okay. I'm gonna do that.
Because it won't allow me to reset it within your own personal settings.
So the way you reset it with me is you designated me as a co-host, and that's probably what made the change, right?
Quite possibly. Let me check and see if I do that with Matt as well.
So
So Matt is a co-host. I think he's about ready to show up.
Worked.
So do we all need to be designated co-hosts in order to get our videos on?
Or if you just log out and log back in.
Okay, I'll try that.
Thank you.
And- yeah. So we'll just give her a minute or two then.
Yeah, I just want to see if Lucy can get back in with video.
It's much less important that our faces are shown. Mo-
So it's much less important for our faces to be shown than to just be able to see Jake's screen or Matt's screen.
I agree with you, Patrick.
Yeah,
I'm not
it's-
looking my
it's
best this
still-
morning.
It's still not working.
All right,
I
So-
mean, yeah,
so let's just move on with the meeting and we'll figure this out later. Go ahead, Matt.
Okay, good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Matt.
So Jake already mentioned the caveats with, well, he mentioned a caveat with projecting forward. Speaking specifically about enrollment. So I just wanted to tack on, and we'll go through this as we go through these slides, but there are other factors as well that we've kind of projected for data points that are needed in order to project these methodologies that we've been talking about. So beyond just the enrollment piece, there are other data points that we are projecting, using assumptions for, that could very well end up not being accurate. So we definitely want to make everyone aware of that, especially as we move forward with the look ahead slides, that these projections are based on certain assumptions and we have no idea if they're going to end up being true. So let's just keep that in mind as we go forward. So Jake mentioned we're gonna do a pretty quick recap on some of the things we've already talked about. I've kind of trimmed down some of the slides that we've looked at in the past related to some of the methodologies we've discussed so that we can get through them a little bit more quickly. The first several slides will be more of a refresher on some of the things that we've already talked about. And then we will move into that look ahead. I'll walk you through some of the details related to that. And then presumably we'll open up for discussion, or I guess it depends on how Nadine wants to approach it. But then we also have a few capital slides for you. The capital slides are very similar to the ones that you've seen in the past with one exception. And then maybe at the end, a discussion related to that, or maybe we do operating capital together and then discuss all of it. I guess we'll look for direction on Nadine for that. So I'm going to start the presentation now. I just want to make sure everyone can see it. I'm not in my home office, so. maybe
Yes,
we-
Matt, we can see it.
Okay. All right.
Nadine, would you like me to bring Kim over?
Yes.
Okay. Can you see a slide that says operating assessments at the top?
Yes.
Okay. So here's a slide, just a quick recap of some of the methodologies we reviewed. We went over Berkshire Hills' current operating assessment methodology, which is based on 1 year of residential enrollment. The way that it's calculated is the towns are assessed based on each town's enrollment relative to the other town's enrollment. Southern Berkshire's, same methodology, same way of calculating the assessments, but it's based on a different metric. It's based on a 5-year rolling average of required minimum contribution. So the towns are assessed based on each town's 5-year average of required minimum contribution relative to the other town's 5-year average. And then what I was calling a common methodology, that's really should be in quotes, common methodology, which is one based on foundation enrollment. We've seen districts assess using foundation enrollment based on a 1-year look, also based on an average of multiple years. And we recently kind of reintroduced the foundation enrollment to some of our discussion. You may recall last time, and we'll go over this again, but when we talked about a separate way to look at the 5-year look back for the safety valve methodology, we did one originally based on required minimum contribution. Then we introduced one based on a 5-year look at foundation enrollment. That was last meeting, I believe. We also went over the hold harmless methodology. Here's a slide that we've carried forward on multiple presentations related to that, which lays out the different parts. Part Part A is the required minimum contribution, that first step down. That's always included. Part B, what we call the hold harmless assessment, which is based on per pupil costs and trying to capture what we view as a current discrepancy in the per pupil costs between the different districts and carrying that forward for several years or perpetuity, whatever ended up being the decision there. We did show a way to phase out the calculated discrepancy in per pupil costs over a 20-year period, just as an example. You probably recall that as well. And then part C is everything else. Once you calculate A and B, there presumably will be an amount to be assessed left over, and that would also need to be assessed a certain way. We looked at doing it via foundation enrollment. We looked at doing it via the 5-year rolling average of the required minimum contributions. It could be done really using any metric, but those are the two that we focused on for part C. Safety valve, which as you're aware, was introduced relatively recently. The last few meetings, we've discussed this pretty heavily. It's designed to ensure that any member town's assessment does not increase more than a calculated percentage each year when compared to the town's assessment from the prior year. So the way that it really works is you have the annual budget increase each year. The safety valve percentage gets added on top of whatever percentage that is. And any town's assessment cannot be increased higher than the total of the two percentages. Any excess above that amount for any town is then allocated to the towns that are not above that threshold based on some metrics. So we've been using, the first time we ran it, we used the 5-year rolling average of required minimum contributions. The second time we used it based on foundation budget, foundation enrollment, but some metric would be needed in order to spread out that excess amongst the towns that could take it. So here are the slides that we presented. This was in last presentation for the look back. It was also this was also in 2 presentations ago, I believe. When we first looked at the safety valve methodology, we were focusing on required minimum contribution. So that's what this slide is. Just an example of how it might work. When we first did the 5-year look back, we assumed that FY19 was the first year of a combined region because we had real data that we could use for these calculations. So we decided to go back 5 years. So it'd be 19, 20, 21, 22, and 23. For what we looked at, FY19 was the first year. So from FY18 to FY19, the budgetary increase that we calculated was 3.7%. If we use the 5-year rolling average for required minimum contributions as the allocation methodology before safety valve adjustment, or if one wasn't used, we had Great Barrington's assessment increase of 2.9% FY19 over FY18. If you include the safety valve, there are other towns whose calculated assessments were above the threshold. So that excess, in order to get them down to the threshold, was spread amongst the towns that could handle it. Great Barrington was one. So their assessment increase changed from a 2.9% to a 4.7% once the safety valve was implemented there. And here's an example of the assessments changing in the opposite direction. Without a safety valve, Sheffield's would have been 12% based on our calculations. The safety valve threshold was 4.7%. So the changes were made to get them down to the threshold. So some of Sheffield's excess was shared with Great Barrington, as you saw in that prior slide. And here's the table that this is the same slide we presented last time. I think even maybe 2 meetings ago. I can't recall for sure, but so this is a nice table structure of a look of some of the data points, some of the calculations that we've done related to the look back. The first column, and this is an average change. So we took all 5 years, FY19 through FY23, and we averaged what the change in assessments would be. That's what these numbers represent. With no safety valve, that's the leftmost column. So if you weren't trying to include the safety valve, if you just had a methodology based on the 5-year rolling average of required minimums with no safety valve, that's what it would look like. And then once you implement the safety valve, that's the middle column. And you can see that, there's a certain threshold that some of the towns didn't go over. It looks like 4.8% is the highest that was calculated. And then for the average, the rightmost column is actual. So just to kind of put it in perspective to what the actual changes were for these towns over the last 5 years, you can compare the first two columns to the actual changes. And then the next 3 slides are the same exact slides I just presented. These were in last presentation, but this is using the foundation enrollment methodology, 5-year average of foundation enrollment rather than a 5-year average of the required minimum contributions. So for this one, Great Barrington went from 2.7 to 4.7. Sheffield went from 11.4 to 4.7. And then here's your the same table showing the same comparison, just using a different metric for the assessment. And then the side-by-side look is here. And the numbers are pretty similar, and it makes sense because the required minimum contribution is heavily based on a town's foundation budget, which is heavily based on a town's foundation enrollment. So the 2 metrics that are being used here, required minimum contribution and foundation enrollment, for the basis of these basis of these assessments, are pretty similar. Foundation enrollment compared to required minimum contribution. So it's not surprising to see a huge swing in the numbers presented in these tables. So now I'm going to transition to the look ahead that we've already talked about a little bit. I might pause real quick just to see if there are any questions related to some of the slides that were just shown, or really some of the, maybe some of the methodologies that you've seen in the recent past. Because now we're going to kind of move into a slightly new area.
I don't see any hands, Matt.
Okay.
Oh, wait, Patrick White's got a hand up.
Hey, quick question. From a town's perspective, with foundation enrollment, we're paying for all the kids. If some of our kids choice out to a different district, does the town then pay that, or does the district pay it?
I think the district, I might be incorrect here. My sense is the district pays it, but it's part of the assessment back to the town. So I guess the answer is both in that case.
And just wondering if the budget's taken into account kind of the cost of choicing of students who might choice out from a given town. And if not, it's fine. I was just curious.
Well, school choice expenses are in the budget numbers that we've been looking at.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I don't see any other hands. Matt, go ahead.
Okay, so with the look ahead, and we wanted to look 5 years in the future to be consistent with what we've been doing with the look back, which was also 5 years. So in order to do the same projection, now keep in mind, we just showed you the look back based on a 5-year average of foundation enrollment. And we showed you a look back based on a 5-year average of required minimum contribution. So in order to do the look forward, you need to have you need to project foundation enrollment, and you also need to project required minimum contribution. Now, in order to project required minimum contribution, there are several factors that go into that. So I did my best to recreate that calculation, but I needed to make assumptions in order to do that. And we'll talk about those assumptions moving forward. So in order to get there, I felt it was necessary to project foundation enrollment, to project foundation budget, because the town's required minimum contribution is typically very heavily based on foundation budget. And I thought it was necessary to project required minimum contribution. Now I have this is the first of the caveats down at the bottom. Projecting data points used to project each item in the list above includes many assumptions that could end up inaccurate. We will talk about those as we go forward. I have some comments on some of those data points as we move forward on these slides. I just wanted you to be aware that there are caveats as we move forward here. All right, so the first piece is projecting foundation enrollment. All right, so I'll just walk you through this kind of real quick. So I recently had a discussion with Sharon on this. So she's already starting to project foundation enrollment for the Berkshire Hills towns for the next school year. So we are currently in the 2022-2023 school year, which is FY23. And she now feels like she has the appropriate data to project foundation enrollment for the upcoming school year, which is FY24, the 2023-2024 school year. But that's based on data that just came out from DESE. SIMS data is now available, and there are a few other factors. DESE actually did a really nice presentation recently related to this, that they presented in a slideshow, which is probably publicly available at this point, how a methodology to use to project foundation enrollment for the next year based on SIMS data and a few other things. So Sharon's already started taking that methodology, and she's starting to do that. But that methodology only gets you 1 year into the future. The SIMS data is not available for the years beyond that at this point. So if we were to project further than just the next year, we would have to look at another way to do that. So Jake already mentioned that there are studies that have been done in the recent past that project enrollment in the districts, and we could leverage that. So Jake and I did spend some time recently going through those studies and trying to get comfortable with what the studies were saying in terms of enrollment projections. So we came up with the result of that is on the second bullet there, that's a little bit smaller. So we combined two studies. That was the NESDEC study that was done in, and Jay, correct me if I'm wrong, 2019, 2020 timeframe. And also the
Berkshire Regional Planning Commission.
right, thank you. Berkshire Regional Planning Commission, which is also done in the 2020 timeframe. So that's
Yeah.
even going back a few years now. But the results of those studies showed an average enrollment decrease of 2.4% during the time period of FY24 through FY28, which is the time frame that we're trying to project forward right now with these slides. So we had that information that we could leverage. Now, this enrollment piece that they've projected is not foundation enrollment. It's enrollment in the districts, in the schools themselves. And we're trying to do one based on foundation enrollment. So it's a little bit different, but we did have that we could leverage. So we were trying, when we were doing the foundation enrollment projections, we were trying to follow the same pattern that those studies suggested, the results of those studies suggested. So we did that, and we were able to hit the target that that the study suggested, and it resulted in the table off to the right, meaning that is the difference between our foundation enrollment projections for FY28 compared to the latest foundation enrollment numbers available from DESE, which was FY23. So I just wanted everyone to take a real quick look at that table to see if that passes the quote unquote smell test.
So just so people, I feel that this is repetitive, but I'll say it again. This would represent the number of children in each of these towns who is public school eligible, like grades K through 12. And what the change in the total number of students living in those communities in those grades would be over this time period. So it's projecting that Great Barrington is gonna go down 76 students, while Egremont goes up 7.
Okay, so we have a couple of questions. Tom Burkle.
So my question is, this is one methodology from my experience where you would backcast to test whether or not you can reflect back and use the same methodology to actually see actual.
Yeah.
And even if you're plus or minus, there's an acceptable range. I mean, you give yourself some wiggle room. So does it look good that way?
So Matt, you gotta help with that one.
I don't
I
think I
think-
understood. Go
So,
ahead.
because in effect, the Ford methodology was based on the back test. If I'm we generated the projections based on the historical pattern. Not
Right,
right.
yeah, so are you saying that we should compare these numbers to the result of the 5-year look back and what the difference was there?
Well,
Was that the question? I'm
It's a
sorry.
good way to determine whether or not your future cast
Yeah, right.
is tight or accurate. I mean, if you're within, 10, 15%, you're probably pretty good. But you can skew something where your future representation really doesn't reflect what you might, expect, because you're going to have people move into the area, move out of the area. How does all that net out?
Yeah, it's a good point. We actually were looking yesterday at what was the 1-year change in each town, what was the 3-year change, what was the 5-year change, and those numbers were different. So you could have seen there wasn't much change, and there was limited change in a 5-year view, but a 1-year view, there was a dramatic change, right? We had 5 kids graduate or something like that, and the number went down or went up. So I think, Matt, when you were even toggling some of the numbers, we were really looking at all 3 of those numbers in terms of trying to set the toggle at a place where we believe it reflected the prevailing trend in that particular town. Again, with all the caveats that Matt's put out there. But
So I just did a quick calc. I guess I could comment on it as long as I'm understanding the question properly. So I just did a quick comparison of the last 5 years of foundation enrollment data that we have. So that would be comparing FY23 to FY18. And I have those numbers. So if I present those, does that answer the question?
Possibly. Yeah, that'd go a long way to it.
Okay, so for Great Barrington, I have a negative 86, so that's within 10. Stockbridge minus 25, West Stockbridge minus 33, Alfred minus 1, Egremont plus 7, Monterey plus 2, New Marlboro minus 41, and Sheffield is the opposite direction. I have that as plus 20, so that's the only one that really kind of stands out as significantly different from the numbers on that slide.
Okay, I mean, and you're gonna have an outlier here or there, and that's what you may be dealing with there, for whatever reason. But it sounds like on balance, most of them are fairly, within a range, an acceptable plus or minus.
And I can comment on that Sheffield number. So we struggled a little bit with projecting that one because Sheffield in the recent years went up, but in FY23, the most recent year, it started going back down. So I think we hung our we kind of focused more on the shorter term change of the downward trend rather than the longer term change, which might have been more upward. That might be the reason why Sheffield's so far off.
Okay, Colin?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a clarifying question because I realize I may not understand things. So we're talking about the foundation numbers which is all the eligible students in the town. Is that correct? Regardless of whether they are attending the school district?
A good way to look at it is the students that the town is financially responsible for.
Right, but they aren't necessarily attending a school in the district. They're just of school age.
That's right.
Okay. And what is Southern Berkshire using for its numbers? Is it using foundation numbers or is it using actual kids attending the schools? I think it's the actual kids attending, correct?
Using it for what? What are they?
Well, when we're doing our assessments, I thought, and this is me maybe not understanding things, I thought we were using the actual kids attending the schools rather than the eligible kids to.
And when you say we, are you talking about Berkshire Hills?
No, I'm talking about Southern Berkshire. Sorry, did I?
Okay. So are you asking what metric is used for their current assessment?
Yes.
Okay, it's not foundation enrollment, it's required minimum contribution. It's the 5-year average of required minimum contribution.
Right, but the student numbers are the actual students attending, not the eligible students in the district, correct?
I don't think that's correct, Colin.
Okay, well, that's why I'm asking, because
Yeah.
I'm confused.
Yeah, so the assessment is based on that average of required minimum contribution. And that is calculated according to that worksheet we looked at last time
Mhm.
with the primary, and Jake, correct me if I'm wrong, with the primary driver of that town assessment being foundation budget, which is calculated based on foundation and enrollment.
That's correct.
So,
Okay,
yeah,
so the answer to my question, I think, and I'm saying this out loud, is that one of the factors in the Southern Berkshire assessment formula is foundation population. Is that correct?
yeah,
That's-
that's,
okay.
that's correct.
Fair.
Okay,
That's
good.
Yeah,
Thank you for clarifying. I just didn't, I wanted to make sure I understood things and I didn't. So thank you.
it relates heavily to the minimum required minimum contribution, which is used for the assessment.
Excellent question, Colin. Patrick White,
Yeah, is the 2.4% the average annual decline, or is that the decline over the 5 years?
So when I say average here, what I did was I calculated the changes year over year, and then I averaged those 5 years of changes.
So is it 2.5% a year, or is it 2.5% total over 5 years?
I guess it's an average of the yearly percentages.
So in other words, over 5 years, it'd be 13 or 14%.
If you were to accumulate them, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Kim,
Hold on, I'm gonna unmute.
you're not muted.
I'm not muted.
You're
Oh my
not.
goodness. I've been cleaning. Sorry, I hope nobody heard that. I just want to verify Colin's take on that, because when I joined school committee, I requested the last 5 years of enrollment versus a data sheet that this committee had provided. And there was a discrepancy in actual enrollment in Southern Berkshire to what the committee had come up, because they weren't counting all our students, including, I believe, our pre-K. So I'm a little confused.
Yeah, Kim, so if you look at the enrollment report, which is online, we were very clear about differentiating between a K through 12 count and a PK through 12 count.
Well, but
so we
with,
did-
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, so those were differentiated out. And PK wasn't included in some of the larger projections that we did.
Well, for us as a smaller school district, I mean, our PK increased like, I believe 60 kids this last year. So, I mean, I just don't understand why all students are not incorporated in these studies.
Yeah, because I mean, well, first of all, I mean, You can take a look in the report if you want, but a quick explanation would be that pre-K numbers are variable across the districts, and they're variable for a variety of reasons. One is the pre-K programs are run in very different ways. They're not full-time, they're half days, they pull kids in from outside, they're sometimes run with the support of a third party, a private vendor. K, compulsory education begins at kindergarten. And so it's where all kids are required to be in school or have a homeschool plan. And so it's really a more consistent marker of where school enrollment starts. It doesn't mean that we're discounting the pre-K. We included those in the numbers, but it's not necessarily predictive. I actually did some analysis even in the study, I believe, in what the retention rate was for pre-K enrollment to kindergarten. And so in some cases, we find that pre-K programs are being used for a single year, and then parents are sending their kids off to their home district. So that's really why we've kept the K through 12 model as the most consistent way, we believe, to project enrollment. It doesn't mean that we discount pre-K enrollment. It doesn't even mean that we discount birth considerations in communities, right? Because what's happening in age 1 and 2 and 3 is also important to watch. Those were factored in to both BRPC and NESDEC. They're into those methodologies. They do look at birth rates, they look at housing developments. It doesn't mean that other things won't influence that or can change in a community that influence both in migration or out migration. So those are somewhat unpredictable. So I believe that both of those methodologies were using information that they had available.
Okay.
So we've answered this. I think I've answered this question a dozen times, and I don't critique you for asking the question. It's an important.
Well, I'm kind of late to the game on all this.
Yeah,
so.
no, but it's there's a lot of confusion when we post both the pre-K through 12 numbers and then the K through 12 numbers because they're different.
Yes.
So I get it.
Thank you, Kim. I think that was a very good question. All right, I don't see any other hands. Go ahead, Matt.
Okay, so it seems like we're generally okay with the projections that we've used here for foundation enrollment.
Yes.
Okay, that's good. All right, so the next step was projecting foundation budgets. So I'll just kind of walk you through the methodology here. It's not perfect, that's for sure, but it's a way of getting at it. So what we did recently was, we looked at recent data. We have each town's foundation budget over the last several years. We have the town's foundation enrollment over the last several years. And we divided the two together to get a foundation budget amount per foundation enrollment student. So in other words, what's the cost? What's the foundation budget cost for that one student? And we looked at how that changed year over year in the recent past. Now it changed a much larger amount in FY23 because of the impact of the Student Opportunities Act on foundation rates. Went up something like, I think overall, if you average everything out, it went up like 7%. But for the Berkshire Hills and Southern Berkshire towns, it went up a little bit higher than that because of the types of students that are there. So we felt it was necessary to, in order to get a foundation budget, kind of project forward what those rates are for the next few fiscal years. And we did that using increases of 7% for FY24 to FY27 and 3% in FY28. The reason why FY28 is different is because supposedly the Student Opportunities Act impact will go away at that point. So it's a little bit higher in the next few years because of the impact of the Student Opportunities Act, like it was in FY23. And also another caveat, this information was not provided by DESE. It's just our knowledge of what we think is going to happen, and they are guesstimates. So in order to get at a foundation budget, once you increase the foundation budget amount per foundation enrollment student, you have the foundation enrollment, which we already talked about in the prior slide. So you multiply the two and you have town's projected foundation budget. Now, down at the bottom is a comment about how this is a simplistic approach because there are different rates for different students and different functions. And we are assuming that they're all changing by the same amount. That will not end up happening. They change at different rates. But in order to project, we thought that was the easiest way. So we increased each rate by the same amount in order to do this. So the results of this work was that now we have foundation budgets for each town over the next few years. So we have foundation enrollment, now we have foundation budgets. And then the next step is projecting the required minimum contributions. And I know this is a busy slide, but keep in mind that we actually went over this in the recent past. I had a slide deck where we went through how each town's required minimum contribution is calculated. And this is essentially saying the same thing. It just walks you through how to calculate it. It can be, the required minimum contribution can be no more than 82.5% of the foundation budget, which is the target local contribution. So we just talked about how we've projected the foundation budget based on certain methodologies. Well, the required minimum contribution for each town can be no more than the 82.5% of the foundation budget that we just projected. So the way that it's calculated is you start with the prior year's required minimum contribution, which we have FY23's. It gets multiplied by the municipal revenue growth factor to get the preliminary required contribution. So we don't yet know what the municipal revenue growth factor is going to be in the future. So we ended up just using an average for the next 5 years. I'm sorry, of the last 5 years. We do know what that average, what those are, so we can average them. And in lieu of having the data for the future, we thought that was the best way to do that. Then you compare the preliminary to the target. If it's more, then the target becomes the required minimum contribution. If it's less, then you may remember that there were increments that get added to the required minimum contribution. If the difference is between 2.5% and 7.5%, it's a 1% increase. If it's greater than 7.5%, it's a 2% increase. We factored all that in for this calculation. The one thing we didn't factor in, which is the comment at the bottom, is that there's a separate test that takes place, which is a special increment. We covered this last time. It's a test of the foundation budget compared to the combined effort yield, which is based on income and EQV. We don't have those data points and we haven't projected them. So there is a small piece here that we weren't able to include when we did our requirement minimum contributions. Just want everyone to be aware of that. Based on some of the things we looked at, there are at least a few towns that probably would be impacted by that increment. Egremont and Monterey seem like they would be. So I just want everyone to be aware that, this is definitely not a perfect methodology. There were just too many factors in play, but we did our best with what we could to project this. All right, so if we go back to that first slide with a look ahead, now we've projected the foundation enrollment, we've projected foundation budget, we've projected the required minimum contributions based on the methodologies that we've shown you. We have the ability to do a look ahead based on foundation enrollment, and we have the ability to do a look ahead based on the required minimum contributions. We have the data points that we need based on these methodologies. All right, so here's our first look at a look ahead table like we just saw with the look back. So we're assuming in this case that FY24 is the first year of a combined region. I think that's probably unlikely at this point, but it's for simplicity, we thought that was the easiest way. But we look 5 years in the future. So you have 24 through 28 to look at. Like we saw with the look back, we saw the average budgetary change year over year to be 3.8%. So we just used that. And this is based on a safety valve of 1%, which we continue to carry in our projections. It doesn't need to be 1%, but that's what we've continued to carry. All right, so the leftmost column is what the projections would be for assessments. Average change for the 5 years. with no safety valve adjustment. And you can see that Egremonts and Monterey's kind of stand out, as the Sheffield a little bit. Egremont and Monterey, we had their enrollment going up if you go back to that table. So over time, generally, their required minimum contributions will presumably go up at a little bit of a higher clip than the other ones, and that's why they show a little bit of a higher percentage. But then look, of course, with a safety valve, it pulls everyone a little bit closer together, as we're used to by now, by how that methodology works. And then the rightmost column is this is actual assessments, but it's the 5-year look back of the 19 through 23 that we included on the other slides, just so you can look at a comparison to what has happened in the recent past. So the first two columns are looking ahead 5 years, and the rightmost column is actual assessment changes the last 5 years, just so you can get a sense. Okay, now let's keep in mind that these projections that we've done here are based on all those different things that we just talked about. And it's, as Jake mentioned, it's imperfect, but it was the best we could come up with for looking forward. I just want to make sure everyone's aware that these are just projections. Okay. And then the same slide for foundation enrollment. And again, you see Egremont and Monterey going up a decent amount there because of what we showed with them going up as well. And the comparison to the actual on the right. So I think the big thing to kind of take away from these slides to me is we've talked about the safety valve at length for a few meetings now, but you can clearly see the impact of it by looking at that middle column. If any town ends up well above the threshold, then they are brought down to the safety valve threshold. And if any town is below, then they presumably would share in the allocation of the excess for those other towns that are above. And you can clearly see that with the data that's in front of you, going from the left column to the middle column. And then here's the side-by-side table that I did on the other slide as well. And again, the two tables are pretty similar, and it's because foundation enrollment plays heavily into the calculation for the required minimum contribution. And here's my kind of wrap-up slide on operating assessments, just to kind of throw out some of the questions that I feel like are on the table, or at least need to be on the table. I'll quickly run through this. Of the methodologies reviewed, is there one that the subcommittee can support? If one, based on foundation enrollment, should the safety valve be included or not? If one, based on required minimum contribution, should the safety valve be included or not? Should a multi-year average, like Southern Berkshire uses today, which is a 5-year average, be used to smooth out spikes that you can see with a 1-year look? So if you were to do a 1-year look, it's going to be a little bit more of a roller coaster. And the Southern Berkshire folks know this. With the multi-year look, there's definitely been that smoothing out once Southern Berkshire transitioned to the 5-year look. If the hold harmless methodology were to be used, then parts B and C need to be discussed. If safety valve, then there needs to be a discussion on the threshold, what to use. As a reminder, we use 1% in all of our runs, but it doesn't need to be 1%. And then kind of a final question, if the subcommittee supports a methodology, how should it be presented to the full board, which presumably will happen in the near future. So that's all I had on the operating assessment piece for today. I'm happy to answer any questions, or we can also just move to capital and then talk about everything. I guess it depends, Nadine, on how you want to approach it.
I've got Tom Burkle with a question or comment. Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I would say thank you, Matt. I know what making projections is like. It can be trying to, handle 2 octopi at once. the only comment I have is we have been using this phrase safety valve, which is okay for us. But if we roll this forward, I think we should get closer. Matt even used the word smoothing. In economics, it's known as a smoothing technique or a smoothed average or rolling average, which is a little easier to understand. Rolling average of 5 years, for a smoothing technique, something like that. Safety valve kind of has like an emergency, pressure release kind of thing associated with it. So when we take it forward, I would like us to at least change the nomenclature. But I think this one has and would get traction in terms of its logic. That's just, again, my sense.
Thank you, Tom. I'm kind of feeling like I'd like to get a sense as to what the committee feels about these methodologies before we move on to capital. Does everyone agree that maybe we should just have a little temperature gauge? Is this safety valve, for lack of a better name, what we're leaning towards? Charlie?
Dean or Matt, could you go back to the previous screen, please?
Right. If I know how to do that. Anyone know how to go back to the prior slide on the presentation without getting out of the presentation?
You hit your left arrow.
Yeah, you should be able to hit the left arrow and it
Oh,
should-
yep, that worked. Thank you. This one, Charlie?
Yes, that's good. Thank you very much. I got what I needed.
Colin?
Nadine, you were just talking about taking a sort of our feeling on the methodologies, and I don't want to put waves in the water here, but Renee had sent something had been sent to us about Renee's idea of a way of doing things. Is that something that plays into these methodologies we're looking at? This is an email I got yesterday.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to completely digest it, and I really was just trying to get a sense of what this committee felt at this point. Should we continue to talk about the first 4 methods that we talked about, or should we continue to look at the safety valve method? Julie, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I took a moment and looked at Renee's piece, and I think this is these slides we're looking at is how we would apportion the budget. And what Renee sent was more how the committee, the 11-person committee that we like, would actually vote.
That's kind of
So
what I thought.
with weighted voting, and
Thank
there's
you,
a little
Julie.
table and metric.
Yeah.
Which
Thank
is
you.
actually very straightforward. I actually like that.
Yeah.
But that's the difference. So what
Sorry.
Renee sent, and I think what Sharon Gregory sent doesn't necessarily, I don't know about Sharon's as much. I only read some of that. But anyway, that's that.
I retract my question. You were correct.
Thank
Okay,
you,
good.
Julie.
Got it.
That's what I thought she sent, but I hadn't had a chance to really digest it all. All right, so I guess back to my original question. Joan, I see Joan's hand up.
Yes, I mean, just from my perspective, in terms of finance committee and trying to think about explaining this to the town and like risk management of, things happening where we get large shifts in our annual assessment, which was, the whole 5-year average discussion from Southern Berkshire. I think the concept of safety valve is great from an operational point of view. And I think it's pretty intuitive. If we said to people, it's a way of sharing or not sharing, distributing, big changes across all the members, it encompasses the concept of all towns together. It shows you that the eventual path towards common, per pupil basis is done in a very intuitive way. So for me, thinking about how would we explain this to the townspeople, I think it's a great idea. It's a great nomenclature, and I think it's a very intuitive thing to be able to explain, and I think it's fair, very
Okay.
fair. So thank you.
Thank you. Patrick? Patrick, you're still muted, or did you take your hand down?
No, I just wanted to say I agree with Joan. I think it's or whoever was just talking. I think it's a reasonable approach to try to smooth what the changes are going to be across the 8 towns, and a nice compromise. I think it's great work, Jake and Matthew. Thank you.
Okay, so I would just like to go down the list of subcommittee board members and see how everyone feels about the safety valve, perhaps being the preferred method we lean on at this stage of the game. Tom Burkle, how do you feel?
I would argue in favor of what we are now referring to as safety valve, yes.
Thank you. Charlie?
I agree with Tom. Also, I'd like to see a change to different, instead of using what Tom said about the safety valve, let's change that to something, but not using safety valve.
Okay. Marie, I know you don't have a voice. But yes, thank you. Michael?
Yes, I support the safety valve.
Colin?
Yes, I support the safety valve for the reasons of other people have mentioned. I just want to make sure that I just want to make one comment that there's 2 parts to that, though. I believe I'm understanding it correctly. In the beginning, when we put these districts together, there's going to be a period of time where it's going to soften the big changes that would occur without it between the Southern Berkshire and the Berkshire Hills. Is that correct? That's happening in the beginning, and then after that, it's as Joan said, it's going to just make any big swings shared. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's the way I interpret it, Colin. This is
Okay.
Jake.
Yep.
I think I generally agree with that as well.
Don Colburn?
I think you should limit the sense of the meeting to the actual members of the committee, not the alternates.
Kim?
Just a quick question. I'm sorry, I'm a little fuzzy on cold medicine this morning.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. What happens when you have 3 children?
Yeah.
So I understand the safety valve and something, but if I remember correctly, a little bit ago, you said something about excess if those numbers didn't cover, or was I misunderstanding?
That's under the hold harmless methodology.
I just want to make sure I
No.
don't have them confused.
No,
You don't.
No,
Okay.
Nadine, actually, it would apply to the safety valve as well.
Oh, it does?
That's what I thought I heard. So please explain that a little bit more on that safety valve method.
Yep. Well, let me go back to that slide that I think
I
would
do
be best.
apologize.
No, that's fine, Kim. These are good questions.
All right, so let's look at this. Can you see the slide right here? It says,
Yes, I can.
yeah, okay. So this is one of the examples we showed related to that I think hopefully will answer your question. So here's how the calculations work related to the safety valve. All right, so the assessments get calculated each year. And then it's determined what 8 towns assessment actually would be done for each of the towns, but what 8 towns assessment is compared to the prior year. So let's say in this case, we're looking at FY19 and we were comparing it to FY18. All right, so Sheffield's calculation was 11.4%. What that meant was if you compare the calculated assessment for Sheffield for FY19 compared to the actual from FY18, theirs went up 11.4%. Okay,
Correct.
you with me so far?
Yep.
Okay, then that gets compared to the what we're calling the safety valve threshold. And that threshold is the budgetary increase plus the safety valve percentage.
Correct.
Okay, so that's the budgetary increase here is 3.7%. That's the difference in budget from FY 18 to 19. Plus the 1%, which is the safety valve percentage.
Correct,
Okay, so that gets you 4.7%, right?
correct.
Okay, so 11.4% is greater than 4.7%.
Last I knew, yes.
Yep, no, I'm just walking you through the details of this. All right, so that means Sheffield is above the threshold.
Correct.
So they have a certain dollar amount that makes them above that threshold. So whatever that dollar amount is, I was calling the excess.
Yes,
So that dollar amount needs to be allocated or distributed amongst the other towns that are below the threshold, below the 4.7%. In order to get Sheffield down to the 4.7%.
so you're going to allocate Sheffield's portions to other towns if they are not hitting the safety valve,
If they're above it, yes.
if they're, right.
So that's what I
If-
meant by excess. And there might be other towns too. And in this example that I ran, Sheffield was one of the towns. There were other towns as well.
So like
If-
Monterey, for example.
Could be. I don't
Yeah.
have it in front of me, but it's possible.
Okay, that answers my question.
Okay, good. So Kim, did you have a feeling on this methodology?
I mean, honestly, there's two methodologies and this would be, to me, the better one.
Okay. Thank you. All right. That gives us a good temperature gauge. I think we're all sort of leaning towards the safety valve being the one that makes the most sense, at least to us. Lucy?
Yeah, I just have a suggestion on a new way to describe it, because I take Tom's point.
Yeah.
And maybe if Tom's agreeable, the word that we could use is smoother. With a smoother, right? Instead of with a safety valve, it'd be with a smoother. It's not really a rolling average. It's more than that, of course, because of this waterfall effect, the excess, the treatment of the excess, as Kim just described it. But it's a tool for smoothing spikes and dips. So maybe we could call it a smoother. Just an idea.
Peter Taylor?
Yeah, what I think is promising about the smoothing effect or the safety valve is that there is the toggle that allows us to look down the road of what that percentage should be, because one of the things I've voiced before in meetings of this committee is that I think we need to be looking at this assessment methodology quickly in conjunction with the capital costs of building the new high school and where that tax burden is going to fall. Because I think we're going to eventually have to look at the political feasibility of these aggregate costs together. And I make this comment, I think with the committee's recognition that I am absolutely 100% for this merger in terms of educational quality and long-term sustainability, but there is, I think, a political environment that we have to be realistic in considering when coming up with a package that will ultimately address all these factors in terms of annual assessments, capital costs, and operating capital, if I understand the third category correctly.
Thank you, Peter. Lucy, your hand is up. Do you still have a comment?
No, sorry.
Okay, that's okay. That's all right. I came up with two words that we might consider. One was equalizing and the other is smooth, swing protection. Just food for thought. Julie?
I like the different words, the smoothing, and I also came up with that equalizer kind of word or something like that. But the swing, I don't know, swing, maybe not so much, but smoother or equalizer. My other question is the two charts that we looked at that Matt did, we were looking at safety valve based on minimum local contribution or foundation enrollment. So I think people are very positive about safety valve, but we will eventually need to fine tune which version of safety valve we like better.
Yeah, Julie, thanks for bringing that up. I was going to bring up the same. So safety valve is really, it's a methodology that ensures that no town's assessment goes up by a certain, by a percentage. In this case, the side that's currently up, it would be 4.7%. That's the max that it could go up. But that initial assessment needs to be calculated based on something, and that Julie just brought that up. So there is a methodology that will need to be selected before the application of the safety valve. And that methodology shown on this current slide is the 5-year rolling average of required minimum contributions. There's also one that we talked about based on foundation enrollment.
Can you show us that side by side slide, Matt? Because I know they were both there. Thank you.
This is the look back one. It's very similar to the project. It's not very similar, but it's the same slide for the look forward. I could show you that too if you'd rather.
Oh,
So-
this is fine. I just, the numbers to me didn't seem to be so dramatically different that,
Right, but and I agree with you, Nadine, they are, because foundation enrollment heavily weighs into the calculation of the required minimum contribution for the 8 towns.
right,
However, there needs to be some definitive methodology chosen here.
Yeah.
Whether it's the 5-year rolling average of the required minimum, whether it's foundation enrollment, whether it's something else,
mhm,
something needs to be put in place for which methodology would be used. And then whether the safety valve is applied or not. It seems
Okay.
like everyone is leaning towards its application, but there still needs to be something that is defined before you get to that point.
Tom Burkle.
Yeah, Matt, it's correct to say, as I think you have said in the past, that foundation enrollment weighs very heavily in the other calculation, correct?
When you say the other calculation, you talk about required minimum contribution?
Correct.
Yes, that's true.
So in
But
other words, in econometrics, what you're saying is that you have something known to mathematicians as heteroscedasticity, meaning there's so much of that in both that it almost doesn't matter. So in my mind, you could use foundation enrollment because I think you've also been making the case that that is what is more commonly used.
We have seen it used quite a bit. If it's more commonly used, I'd say probably. I don't have the numbers to back that up. But yes, we have seen it used.
But you would say that it was maybe more conventionally accepted as a general practice, yes?
I would argue that. Yeah.
Okay.
Patrick White.
The only part about this I'd be a little more comfortable with is if the safety valve number was 2 or 3% rather than 1%.
Do you have a preference, Patrick, on required minimum contribution or foundation enrollment?
I mean, and from the analysis, it looks like it's about the same, right? I think the question is how long it takes for the smoothing to get us to really the foundation enrollment, eventuality. And so for that, I don't really have an opinion on that. I do think that, that a number like 2 or 3% gets us there in 5 to 7 years. I think that was our calculation rather than 10 to 15 years. I mean, maybe Matt could talk to that.
Yeah, that run was done, when we did that, that was based on, we've made the projections more robust now than that initial run that we did, because at that point, we hadn't projected things like foundation enrollment, and we hadn't projected things like the required minimum contributions going forward. So we just carried those numbers forward every year. But you're right, that when we ran that, I think we had the smoothing out happening. That's not the right term. We had the elimination of the safety valve application happening after, I think it was 14 or 15 years.
Julie,
I think it would behoove, or I know I personally, and first, let me recognize I'm not a committee member, so it's just a public opinion. But I'd like to dig a little deeper and go back. I mean, maybe not as a group, but personally would want to go back and look at what else is in required minimum contribution for factors besides foundation enrollment, because they're different for a reason, and I'd like to be able to look at that. So I know we've had good luck in Southern Berkshire with that required local minimum contribution. And I think in looking at what Patrick suggested, the different safety valve, we could look at that. I like the 1%, 1.5%, 2%. I think if it was much more than 2%, or I mean, we could look at it 2.5 and 3 and see how long it takes for the equalizing effect. But I think if the equalizing effect is too fast, the Southern Berkshire towns will be feeling a much larger burden than what they will politically be happy with.
thank you, Julie.
Yeah, so Nadine, can I just build off that just for?
Yeah,
real quick?
absolutely.
Okay, so, yeah, just want to make sure everyone's clear on that. So if the safety valve were to be implemented and the percentage were chosen to be 3%, which Patrick just mentioned as a possibility a few moments ago, what that means is whatever the budgetary increase is, and it's in a random year, a given year, let's say we've seen 3.8% come up over and over again when we've done our calculations. 3% for the safety valve gets added on top of that. So it's 3.8% plus 3% equals 6.8%. So that would mean that that's the maximum that a town's assessment could go up in a given year. So is that okay? You know, those are the things you should be thinking about if you're thinking about it. Trying to implement the safety valve application, safety valve methodology, is that could mean that a town's assessment could go up 6.8% or even higher. I mean, if the budget goes up 4.5% in a given year, then it could be higher. So these are just things you need to think about.
Yeah, Kim,
So knowing and coming from Southern Berkshire and as a taxpayer and stuff, knowing that we haven't had anything close to those numbers, how do we explain to them why it's going up 3 times as much as what they're used to? I mean, I'm just not, I'm not seeing where your calculations are coming from. I'm trying on when you're I don't know. I'll just withdraw my question.
Patrick,
Well, the increase, as I understood it, is there's that student act that is going to increase costs for both districts, regardless of whether we merge. And also we're doing things like equalizing teacher pay that is going to cost us all money over the time, but that's the right thing to do. I think to answer the prior speaker's question, where Kim's question, we're trying to, take into account the reality that expenses are going to go up regardless of whether or not this merger goes through. And so we don't want to blame the merger for those increase in expenses.
good point. Julie, I see your hand up again, or still?
Yeah, no, I took it down and put it up. Thanks, Nadine. I think the one thing, and I think Kim did hit it. Southern Berkshire towns are not used to those kind of rates, and that's what I was sort of alluding to as well. But I think just a bigger, more of a financial philosophical approach too is Southern Berkshire has been very frugal in really being cognizant of the amount of tax increases. And, Berkshire Hills has been a little bit more generous with those increases. So I think one of the things to consider long range is just how do we meld the financial philosophies of what we feel our taxpayers can handle. And that's what we're trying to do. But I did have someone say to me, it's like, well, okay, we're going to equalize out, but why would we equalize when it's really, we're trying to bring Berkshire Hills down but it's making us go up. So I think it's going to be quite a interesting dance to try to figure out how to philosophically bring the finances together and answer these kind of questions. And while I've got this, here, I have to let you know, I have to leave in just a moment or two for a funeral. But this has been a great conversation. Thank you.
Lucy,
Yeah, I mean, I think Kim's question is very important in terms of how we roll this out to Southern Berkshire. And I think Julie and Patrick hit on part of the answer, which is, the decision was made by this subcommittee at the last meeting that they think it's fair and appropriate that faculty and staff at Southern Berkshire be equalized on a pay schedule with Berkshire Hills. So if you believe that, if folks in Southern Berkshire agree with that, then they will understand that there's a cost associated with that. So that's part of the discrepancy right there. And then I think, we all need to go back to that presentation that Matt made about where this discrepancy comes from. And there's a big chunk of money, as I recall, in special ed, with Berkshire Hills having much more expense in that area with sending kids outside the district to get the services they need than we have historically experienced in Southern Berkshire, but that very well may change. So there are reasons that don't really have to do with frugality per se, or one district being more generous than another. But there are specific reasons for that per pupil difference that we need to be able, ready, and prepared to explain. I do think before we talk about a 2 or 3% safety valve as opposed to 1%, we really need to run those numbers.
yeah,
So people see not only how much the Southern Berkshire towns are going to go up, but how much the Berkshire Hills towns will go down, right? In comparison to the overall budget increase. So let's not forget that by Southern Berkshire towns picking up greater percentages in the overall budget increase, the result is that Berkshire Hill towns are maybe picking up a lower percentage than the overall budget increase. So we really need to see the side by sides before we make any decision on whether it's 1%, 1.5%, 2%, or 3%.
thank you, Lucy. I was going to ask Matt to run those for our next meeting so that we can take a look at them. Patrick?
Just to throw it out there, another compromise might be to have a safety valve of 1% for the first 5 years, and then afterwards, scale it to 2% or something like that. So to just take into account the fact that we don't know how long it's going to take, but that over time, 15 years is a long time to not get to a point where we're equalized. So I think that there's some ways we might compromise that could meet everyone's needs. Thanks.
Julie?
Yeah, my last comment before I take off. I absolutely agree, and Lucy is right, and I'm one of the very outspoken people in terms of teacher parity with the salaries and all of that sort of thing. But I do think that moving forward, perhaps we need to have a stronger negotiating team in terms of salary increases for future. I do believe teachers need to be at the same level at the starting point, but perhaps there will be some ways to have ongoing operating expenses contained a bit, and strong salary negotiation would be one. I don't know what the numbers are for either district right now. But clearly Southern Berkshire has kept that part down, be it good, bad, or otherwise. That's not what I'm saying. I think all educators deserve as much money as we can possibly give them. But I think the philosophy of how we contain our costs moving forward together is something that we will need to really work on. But thanks so much for your time today.
Peter Taylor?
Thanks, Nadine. I think as we're looking at, a 1.5%, 2% type of variance on the smoothing tool, I think it would be helpful also, and I mentioned this at the last meeting, to see what is the do nothing rise in percentages for each of the towns, just because I think that would be, helpful as we look at this through a political lens. And also, I mentioned this in my last comment in previous meetings. I think looking at this in isolation without the capital cost of the new high school, I think is going to be difficult for those outside of this committee. So I think being able to factor in, as we look at the safety valve, the predicted cost of the high school and how that's going to fall on the 8 towns as well.
That is a perfect segue, Peter Taylor. Michael, just one more. Go ahead, Michael.
If Matt can go to the slide with the questions he had. Other than looking at what the percentage would be of the safety valve, can we see if we have a consensus on the other ones, like, required minimum contribution? I'd be in favor of using that, using a multi-year average. Yes, so that would allow us to narrow this discussion for the next meeting.
Charlie?
We need to look at the big picture here also. What happens if we don't combine? What is it going to cost for our kids to go to the CVTE programs? If there was 40, 50 kids at $20,000, you're talking some serious money. So we need to look at the whole big picture. Thank you.
Okay, I think there is some thought process that needs to be given to which of the 2 methodologies, and I think I'd like us all to think about that a little bit, to discuss a bit further at our next meeting, because I'd really like to talk a little bit about capital today if we can.
What are the 2 methodologies you're referring to there, Nadine?
The required minimum contribution or the foundation enrollment.
Okay.
We need to think about which one of those calculations, with the safety valve being the primary conversation topic. We all seem to be in favor of the safety valve, but we have to decide whether we're going with required minimum contribution or foundation enrollment. And I personally feel like I want to dig into that just a tad bit more. I don't see a significant difference either way. So right now I could go either way, but I think I personally want to take a deeper dive into that before I speak to that fully.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I could just jump in there, I think there is, although the numbers in the slide presented right now look very close. And it's because, as Tom said, the primary driver of required minimum contribution is foundation enrollment. As Matt said before, that could change in the future. So there is actually a philosophical difference between those 2 methodologies that I think we should talk about before we make a decision on which one we go with.
Yeah, I agree. I believe it is a philosophical decision, but I want to make sure that that's the full accuracy of that conversation for me.
Mhm.
Yep. So Nadine, let me just make a few quick comments on that, just as a little bit of a refresher for the required minimum contribution. So foundation enrollment is based on students. We know that. Those are students that the towns are financially responsible for. Required minimum contribution, as we just talked about, is heavily based on foundation enrollment, but it's also based on a few other factors. We talked about municipal revenue growth factor earlier. That is factored in. That is calculated based on each town's local revenues in a given year. So that plays into the required minimum contribution. So that would be revenue changes year over year, but at the local level. Inflation factors in as well. And as Lucy just mentioned a moment ago, currently each town's required minimum contribution is based on its foundation budget. The 82.5% that we were talking about earlier is the target. But that is because other factors like income and EQV, there's that test that takes place. And we talked about this when we went over the required minimum calculation. And whichever is less is what's used. And in this case, the foundation budget 82.5% is less, and that is what's used. But as Lucy just mentioned, and we talked about before, it could flip at some point. It could change where the income factors, income and EQV, or the wealth factors, income and EQV would matter rather than the foundation budget. So those are pieces in the required minimum contribution area that need to be considered. Foundation enrollment, municipal revenue growth factor, inflation, and the possibility that the wealth factors could come into play in the future based on that test that takes place every year when this calculation is done by DESE.
Thank you, Matt. That clears up the little bit of fog that was in my head on it. With Matt adding that piece of information, do any of the board members have a preference at this stage of the game to foundation enrollment or required minimum contribution? Peter Taylor.
Yeah, I just have a question for Matt. You're using an assumption of 3.8% inflation. And as that's a factor of required minimum contribution, that inflation projection seems low to me. I'm just curious if others feel that too, and should that be adjusted if we're evaluating these two scenarios, these two cases?
So just as a reminder, the 3.8% is based on, you're right, that it's based on a look back. That's what the average increase was over the last 5 years, but that doesn't mean that's going to be the increase going forward.
Patrick.
I prefer foundation enrollment just because EQV factors so heavily into the capital formula.
Kim.
I was just going to agree with the person prior to the last comment about possibly adjusting the inflation, because 5 years ago is definitely not the same as the last 2 years. And it doesn't seem to be reversing. So, I mean, I just don't see it as feasible at a 3.8. But I still am out on whether I want to go either way on minimum contribution or foundation enrollment.
Yeah, that's fine. I'm, you're still coming up to speed on
Yeah.
things, so I don't blame you for wanting to think about it a bit. Charlie Ketchen, do you have an opinion one way or the other?
Not at this time, Nadine.
Okay, that's
Either
fine.
one of them would work, but I'll wait and read a little bit more.
Okay, that's fine. Tom Burkle.
Well, as I said before, so much of the one uses the foundation enrollment that to me, for all practical purposes, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. But the minimum contribution does hold a wealthy, quote unquote, town's feet to the fire and runs up potentially their contribution where it otherwise might decline if their foundation enrollment keeps going down.
So that sounded like a neutral.
Yeah, I'm almost indifferent to one.
Okay. Thank you, Tom. Marie Ryan, do you have an opinion one way or the other?
Not yet.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I have a feeling we need to think about this a bit more, but Michael, do you have an opinion one way or the other?
I feel like the RMC.
Okay. Okay, I think Colin is gone and, all right, so
Can I recap just a couple things, make sure we're going to follow up on the right things?
please,
We're going to run the the cap with some adjustments, we'll look at like 2%, 3%, just to give you an example of how that plays out. We'll try to run some sort of scenario, which is to do nothing, which is that the district continue to move forward alone, and then build in at least some simulation of how that would look if we, if a number of kids from Southern Berkshire were to tuition into CVTE into Berkshire Hills, how that would impact them financially. There was a question around the naming of this methodology. We'll come up with some descriptors and bring those at the next meeting. And then I think a continued conversation around the required minimum versus foundation as a preference as to how we approach the safety valve. That's what I have on my list. Did I miss anything?
Inflation.
Inflation.
Yeah, I have a problem with use of that term to describe average budget increases, right? I mean, budgets do not track precisely annual inflation rates. The largest driver of a budget is salaries, and salaries are dictated by collective bargaining agreements that are multi-year. So I don't think we should be using that term when we describe average budget increases.
Good point.
So are you looking for us to run budget increases that look different than the 3.8%? So run 2%, 3%? I mean, I think for Matt, it's just a toggle switch, so.
Yeah. Michael, do you have an opinion on that?
Two things. You should just use the 3.8 because I mean, it's a guess at what it would be. And
right.
But the other one is, I think we've been using the 5-year average, and we should just confirm that that is what we want to look at, because one of these is using a multi-year or a 1-year or 3-year or whatever. So maybe we should just begin narrowing this down.
Okay, that's good. All right, so that I think we have our marching orders.
Indeed.
Or at least on this particular part of it. The only other thing I did want to offer, I didn't editorialize much this meeting, but I'll just offer one editorial comment, and that is Patrick sometime back talked about this idea of the cap and, having out of the gate a 1% and then maybe increasing it over time. The idea behind, I think, keeping the cap lower out of the gate is that we're trying to smooth the differences between the two districts, that if we have a higher cap, will be more amplified. And so then we'd see a bigger liability to the Southern Berkshire towns, and that may be a problem in terms of the political, sort of sales of this methodology. So what Patrick offered up might be an interesting way to think about it, which is 1% out of the gate, and then down the road a higher percentage, which then would really just more accurately reflect what's actually happening in the communities. I'm not sure I support that, but I think it's certainly an interesting way to think about it.
Any other comments, questions before we move on to capital? Okay. Capital.
Okay, so capital slides are probably going to be familiar to you. It's kind of a refresher with one, actually, I think 2 slides changed, but they're very similar to what we've shown in the past. But one additional thing for you to consider that we'll talk about in a moment. So the three buckets, as I've been calling them, are existing debt. These are major capital improvements that have taken place in the recent past. Oops. For the different districts, debt that's currently on the books, how to handle that, new high school project, and then other future capital expenses, what to do about those. So just like with the operating piece, there presumably needs to be some methodology in place for how to assess those future capital expenses, and that needs to be decided as well. So the first one is talking about existing debt. The slide has changed just a little bit since we last showed it. The top section talks about major capital improvements and debt obligations related to that. Berkshire Hills debt is coming off the books the next fiscal year, FY '24. Southern Berkshire is not until FY '32. Based on the debt schedule that exists for Southern Berkshire, the debt liability is about $350,000 current fiscal year of FY '23, and it decreases downward to about $260,000 FY '32, which is the final year. The last 5 years, the average for the last 5 years is $278,000. And we'll talk a little bit more about that number in a second. Presumably this debt would stay with Southern Berkshire, the Southern Berkshire towns in a combined region. And the 278,000, we're looking at this as a possibility that it represents debt capacity for Southern Berkshire towns, that they can support the shifting of high school, some of the high school debt that's projected, once the current debt obligation comes off the books. So look at it this way, Southern Berkshire towns are currently paying for an annual debt liability of the numbers that I just showed you. When that's off the books, then that debt capacity exists, and perhaps some of the debt obligation that is being covered by Berkshire Hill towns for the new high school could then get shifted to the Southern Berkshire towns so that they're paying the same amount of debt as they are today. Something to think about moving forward. I'll show you the results of that in a second. How to assess minor capital improvements. So Southern Berkshire has about $350,000 annually in its budget. That's something to factor how that would be assessed, how that would work in the annual calculations. Same with Berkshire Hills. Recently, they haven't really had minor ones because it's been covered by E&D. Those haven't been assessed. But if it were to be assessed, then it's assessed using the same way as operating, which is based on the resident enrollment, as we talked about prior. So these things need to be considered, how to assess these things moving forward, and then the major capital piece, what to do about the debt in the future. This is the same high school slide that we've looked at that has a 90-10 split. It based on the calculations that we did a long time ago, these numbers have not changed. We have the debt liability of the Berkshire Hills towns about 2.4 million annually, and the debt liability of the Southern Berkshire towns has $235,000 annually. And based on those numbers, this is a way that they could be assessed. And because there's a different share taking place, we looked at the assessing of debt for the high school project separately, with the Berkshire Hills towns calculated based on their shares relative to one another, and the Southern Berkshire towns calculated based on their shares relative to one another. We use EQV mainly because that's what's used for Berkshire Hills major capital improvements today. But again, it doesn't need to be the methodology, but that's what we did for this run. So you can see the impact here of the 2.4, the breakdown, and then the 235,000 down below. And then the next slide has that adjustment that takes place. So we calculated the average annual debt obligation for the Southern Berkshire towns for the last 5 years of about 278,000. I think it was close to 280. So the next slide shows the shifting of that 280 away from the Berkshire Hills towns and to the Southern Berkshire towns, because in theory, the Southern Berkshire towns have debt capacity to handle that once their current debt comes off the books. And that's what this slide represents. So you can see the adjusted amount up above, which was the prior amount, less about 280,000, and the new calculations, and then also the Southern Berkshire amount, which is the amount on the prior slide plus the 280. They could, in theory, take on additional debt liability at that point. Now, the one thing that's kind of flawed about this slide is that we're still using the EQV amounts that are current. If EQV were to be chosen as the methodology, then these numbers would get updated down the road, because we're talking about FY 32 at this point. So presumably the EQV numbers would be 10 years from now, but this still shows you what the calculation would be based on EQV numbers. And then the final slide is this one I've shown you before, just other future capital. This would be major improvements, how to assess. There's several methodologies that could be used. I'm showing you one based on EQV, one based on the 5-year rolling average of required minimum, and also one based on the 5-year rolling average of foundation enrollment. This is just an example I chose, $1 million capital purchase, which based on a run through a debt schedule works out to be about $775,000 annually. This is a different way to distribute that $75,000 annually based on different methodologies. So, just something to look at here for how to assess future capital. And another thing to think about is that, it doesn't have to be EQV. You could just end up choosing to do the same type of methodology that you end up choosing for the operating assessments. Or it could be different, but these are things that need to be thought about moving forward. And then kind of a wrap up slide for capital. These are some of the things I just talked about for major capital improvements, other than the high school project. How to handle the debt that Southern Berkshire currently has on its books until 2032. How to handle new debt. Any new debt, how would it be assessed? EQV, the operating assessment methodology, some other metric. Minor capital items for both districts, they're currently assessed using the same methodology as operating. So is that how you want to do it moving forward? For the new high school project, the 90-10 split, whether Southern Berkshire can take on that additional debt once their current debt comes off the books, and then anything else. So like I did with the operating piece, I tried to kind of wrap it up on this slide for what I consider to be the major talking points.
And I appreciate that, Matt.
All right, well, that's good.
Comments, questions, thoughts? Joan, thank you.
Yeah, Matt, when you increase the share of Southern Berkshire Town's debt in the back end, that's like 15 years, is that right? Because the original term was 25, and after 10 years, Southern Berkshire's currently existing debt will be gone. Is it? So it's 15 years at the additional rate, right? So my question is, if I'm understanding this correctly, the first split was 90-10. So just for me, what is that new percentage split when you add that additional debt on the back end for Southern Berkshire Towns?
So you're saying when we shift the 280 over, what's the
Yes.
breakdown?
Yes, then how do I think about, from a very simplistic point of view, what does the 90-10 split become? What has that become?
I don't think we actually did that, Matt, did we?
No.
I mean, Southern Berkshire is paying a larger dollar amount, right, than they were in the base 90-10 split. So I'm just wondering, conceptually, like, just perspective wise, what does that become? Has it become 85-15 or,
You can add that to the to-do list for the next meeting.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thank you.
It won't take too long to figure that out.
Right, exactly.
And I think that's what we heard at the last meeting, and that's why we ran this way.
Yeah.
It's not, it's not the only way to approach this. It was just, I believe we heard that, given the fact that Southern Berkshire is carrying debt, would there be the possibility of, once that debt is expired, to continue those debt payments, but contribute towards a new high school? And that's actually really very simplistically what we did.
Yeah, I missed that meeting. I apologize if it's sort of a redundant question.
But we
Michael?
didn't, right, we didn't calculate the percentages, Joan, so it's a good question. So,
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, Joan. I'm sorry, Michael, go ahead.
So if we're forming one district, and I know I've heard Marie say this, that we should be treating all as one, why can't we also look at just bringing that debt of Southern Berkshire rate in from day one and adjusting the percentage? Then two is, if you go to the slide about the 75,000, using the 5-year RMC, say in the first 25 years, we have to make $5 million of improvement into schools in Southern Berkshire Regional School District. For whatever reason, it would only be a 5 million in debt in capital projects that would result in Berkshire Hills Regional School District paying the same amount as the schools are currently paying to go in on a $100 million high school. So, for example, 5 million would be 228,000 annual debt payments. So I think that's something that needs to be considered, because we're not beginning with an even thing, but we're going to even it out later on with future debt. So maybe I'm just not aware of where this 90-10 automatic consideration came from. So maybe somebody can fill me in on that.
I'm sorry, I missed the second point that Michael made. Michael, can you just make that second point again?
So if we take on, so at $1 million, 75,000 for $1 million. And if we were to use the 5-year RMC, then what you would end up doing is on $5 million borrowing, anytime in that 25 years, the annual payment would be almost the same as what the Southern Berkshire towns are paying to go in on a $100 million school. So, you know, it's because there's a number of just trying to figure out how this works fairly. And like I said, I just was looking at the numbers and saying this would bring on this amount for future capital, because there's going to be future capital in 25 years.
yeah, no question, Michael. And I think the attitude we were taking was that it's after getting through this high school project, the idea is we look at all facilities as a combined 8-town district effort. So if there's another way to think about it, then I think we're certainly open to that. But the idea was that any future capital debt would be shared according to some methodology, 3 here on the screen, right? For those projects. And I guess the question is, you know, what are those potential projects going to be and how much are they going to cost? So I think originally Matt put in a figure of $10 million, and I said, I don't know if that kind of choked on that, like what would cost $10 million? And so we were thinking of, obviously it's heating, ventilation, it's roofing. Those are your big ticket items, right? There certainly could be others. You know, if you were doing window replacements or things of that sort, or upgrades to science labs. But I'd also assume that in the next 25 years, if that were to occur, we might also engage in a partnership with the Mass School Building Authority in a 2nd-tier project somewhere down the road to maybe do some of that work.
Right. But I was just using it on just strictly on the numbers.
Yeah.
So like I said, if you used a $5 million over the next thing, the 3 towns of Berkshire Hills would be paying in 228,000, while the
Right.
schools in Southern Berkshire would be chipping in 146. And that's on a 5 million. And say that was 5 million for Mount Everett, just making an assumption.
Yeah.
You'd be paying in the same amount as being paid into the regional high school on only 5 million, if that was our share. So
yeah.
Patrick?
Yeah, I mean, I think that future capital, to Michael's point, is much more likely on the older buildings than the new combined district. The new high school, I would imagine, wouldn't have much in terms of additional capital contributions in the next 20 or 30 years. So, I think Michael's point is just if we're gonna have a differentiation of the weight of expense on the new high school, should we have a differentiation of the weight of expense on the old buildings in a reverse manner? Because those buildings have to be maintained if we don't merge, the same way that they'll have to be maintained if we do merge. And so, it's just a question of if we're going with this assumption that, for political reasons or otherwise, that the Berkshire Hills towns are going to pay the bulk of the new high school, should we then pay an even share of the expenses on the old buildings, if there are any?
Okay, I get it now.
Yeah, I guess my quick reaction to that would be the idea that you're operating as an 8-town district after you get through this initial courtship, right? This merger. And you could certainly, I mean, it's going to get complicated because you can certainly look at buildings as being more connected to a particular town of the 8 towns, right? Or multiple towns of the 8 towns. I don't know that I love that, because you're invariably going to have issues with Du Bois and Muddy Brook, probably at a similar pace that you're going to have with Undermountain and Mount Everett. So the question then becomes, okay, well then when the roof needs to be done in Muddy Brook and Du Bois, do we want to start looking at, the 3 towns? That to me is going to be very clunky in an 8-town merged model. That's my own take.
Lucy?
Yeah, I think Patrick and Michael make a legitimate point, and not so much with respect to Mount Everett and Undermountain, but with respect to New Marlboro and Egremont, right? So those 2 schools are in a different category from Mount Everett, Undermountain, Du Bois, Muddy Brook, and the new high school. And I get the logic of the argument. Like if we're doing something special for the new school in Great Barrington because Berkshire Hills needs to build that school either way. So they should be picking up the cost, at least the cost of what it would cost them if we didn't merge, which is where Michael, the 90-10 comes from. The 10 was an estimate of the incremental cost to build that school so it could house another 165 kids, basically. But if we're using that logic for the new high school in Great Barrington, I think that logic could apply to, capital costs to keep the schools in New Marlboro and Egremont functioning. So I think it's a legitimate point of discussion.
I agree, Lucy, because the first thing that popped into my mind is the age of the New Marlboro building. And I mean, I know Egremont has, brought their building recently up to more modern standards, and I'm not so sure that that's as much of an issue as the New Marlboro building, but I definitely have some thoughts on that. Michael?
Yeah, just what if we were to look at just bringing the bond, the current debt of Southern Berkshire right in and distributing it from day one, and even looking at that 350 that's in their budget for capital and bringing that rate in, and then just saying, let's use the RMC and see where the school would come in at, the new school, and bringing all of our capital together and really making it one district right from day one.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly worth running. I just want to, since Peter Dillon isn't on, I just want to raise the cautionary flag he raised a couple of meetings ago, which was, you know, the equalized value at Berkshire Hills for capital costs was a really important step for Berkshire Hills, and one that, you know, I think we need to be very careful about reversing by going to required minimum contribution, because that's got big ramifications, I think, for the building of the new school in Great Barrington.
And the RMC on all the debt instead of trying to treat future buildings differently, current building differently. If you're forming a district, form a district.
Right, but by going to RMC on the new building, wouldn't you be shifting a lot more debt service to Great Barrington from Stockbridge, for example? Isn't that what this table shows?
It could be, so run the EQV and the RMC on both, because Southern Berkshire uses RMC, right?
Right, correct.
Right. So run the two over and take all the capital that's currently being paid by Southern Berkshire and building it in, because Berkshire Hills is dropping that one, and then just the new school, and figure out what it would look like in all those scenarios. So.
Tom?
Yeah, you're always going to have a capital line in your budget. That's what the 320 or whatever it is in Southern Berkshire represents. And even with a brand spanking new school, you're going to have a capital line in your budget. So that's going to become the obligation of all participating towns. Now, Michael's point about just subsuming the debt from Southern Berkshire as part of that ongoing capital / debt perspective does make a lot of sense from the simplification method. The cost split on the construction, one-time construction cost of the new school can in fact be a separate matter. It's almost like building a new plant. The plant capital construction cost is one thing, and then the ongoing capital required there, you know, going forward for all buildings in all 8 towns becomes one line item in your annual budget. And just as the closure of an old building, that savings would redound back to the full district. So, for example, we know New Marlboro Central will not last forever. It's got issues today. When that gets closed, if and when, then, you know, that's going to be part of your capital budget for all 8 towns, because that's going to be in the future. The one-time construction cost can be split for whatever reasons in a different manner. But once you get up and running, you're going to have a annual line item budget for capital expenditure.
Patrick?
Yeah, look at the, I understand where 90-10 came from. I do just want to make a point that that the 10% represents right sizing the new school for the additional students, but I don't believe it takes into account the fact that the 100 million includes building an entire new vocational program that we all benefit from, and that is, I think, the #1 driver for why we should do this merger. Is that, go back to that slide from a year ago, whenever, where 50% of the kids don't graduate from college or even go to college. All right, so we all have to recognize that we are vastly improving the educational experience of a great number of future students by doing this merger. And so one question I would have should there be a shared cost of the vocational part of that investment? That's one question. The second point I would make is that if it were purely based on foundation enrollment or RMV or whatever, I believe the split would be 61-39, not 90-10. Now, I understand we're not going to do that, but but especially with Michael's idea of pulling the debt from day one of South Berkshire in, could we do a similar safety valve strategy to then equalize those payments based on whether it's EQV or RMV or whatever, RMC, over time, so that we get to a point sometime in the future where we're sharing capital expenses on a rational basis.
Lucy?
I'm sorry, I meant to bring my hand down.
Okay, you're forgiven.
Thank you.
So I think we've had some interesting questions on a new way to look at some different ways to look at the capital assessment. So I guess I'm just asking Jake and Matt if you can pull
Yeah.
those thoughts together.
Yeah, so let's see if I got this right. So it sounds to me like one option is to fold the current Southern Berkshire debt into the 8-town model from the get-go and see how that plays out. The second is to run all the debt across the 8 towns, including new high school. I think I heard that in one argument, and then I heard that shouldn't be in another argument. Put it all together and then reallocate it, say using EQV, and see how that turns out. My gut tells me that's going to be a significant liability to some of the Southern Berkshire towns, which is, our argument from the very beginning was if there's excessive liability on capital for this new high school, it's going to be a problem. And I continue to believe that that's the case, but we'll run it and see how that does it. I think those are the two things. Did I miss anything else?
Well, I think that Patrick suggested thinking about applying a safety valve methodology on the capital side, which is interesting to me because I have no idea how that would work. I haven't really thought it through, but wouldn't it be nice if we could explain both capital and operating by referring to a smoothing mechanism for both? It would be an easier explanation. I just want to share with the group. We had our meeting in Alford where we presented the work we've been doing so far a couple of weeks ago. And the 90-10, although, attractive to Alford from an economic perspective, there were some people who actually didn't believe we were really seriously considering that. I mean, it requires explanation, as Michael, demonstrated today. Like, where did the 90-10 come from? And it does require some explanation. So if we could sort of get to the same numbers or close to the same numbers by using a safety valve mechanism, that might be good. I don't know. I hadn't thought about that before.
I like the idea of it being consistent from operating to capital. I just think it's less conversation at town meeting as to why there's a difference, but I absolutely agree with Jake that the political fallout could just send this whole thing down in flames. Patrick?
But okay, the reason why some of us in Berkshire Hills support I mean, our debt's fallen off in 24. Okay, so we're going from zero to $800,000 basically. And the reason to do that is because of education quality. Okay, we get that. That's why we strongly support the new high school. All right. And I think that like it's incumbent on our community outreach group, I think, to really make the case for how much education quality goes up with this new district. And that's true not just for Berkshire Hills, but it's true for South Berkshire too. And I think the key to that argument is that we're all getting a vocation program that rivals what North Berkshire has that we don't have now. And if it's just about the numbers, this is going to go down in flames. This has got to be about education quality and about how we've got to invest in giving what children we have better opportunities. And in doing so, we attract folks who are looking for places to raise their family because of the quality of the schools that we offer. I mean, there's really philosophical questions, and I don't think it can just be about the money.
Any other comments? Kim?
I agree to the point of the comment right before mine, but you have two different philosophical ways of looking at education between the two districts. So it's not just going to be about outreach, it's also going to be about the educational subcommittee, working together too. Because, I mean, we're an all encompassing in our high school moving towards college. That is something they stress a lot. So, I mean, I don't know how to phrase this, but it's not just about the money, but you got to come together on the way you view education.
Thank you, Kim. Joan?
Yes, I just wanted to suggest that, the question Charlie raised before about the costs of schools, if Southern Berkshire towns cost to choice or tuition these, students to the CVTE, which is, I agree, it adds tremendously to the educational quality. If we can quantify that, if the districts do not merge, I did like a rough calculation using Matt's old spreadsheet, and in 3 years, if let's say Sheffield had 20 kids, and if it was 20 grand a kid, their budget would look similar to what it would be in the would increase by the same amount as it would under the new merged school district. So I think to be able to illustrate to people who think there's a value in that new school and we can just send our kids up there if they're interested in that, there's a cost to that too. And I think I would just encourage that calculation that Charlie was asking about, because I think that sort of puts the costs in perspective also. Thank you.
I think you're right, Joan. I think that's going to make on paper, black and white numbers, light bulb go on over a lot of heads. So I think that's a very important piece for us to look at our next meeting. Kim, your hand is up again, or still? I'm not sure.
I'm sorry. I think it was just.
That's okay. That's
but
okay.
You also, in that light bulb moment, have to figure out how many kids would utilize it too, to actually go to a CVT or a VOTEC. And trust me, I'm not against VOTEC whatsoever. My husband went to the trade school at Mount Everett, but you have to put it in perspective also.
Yeah, and therein lies the mystery calculation.
Yes.
Yet another mystery calculation.
Yeah, and I think that's the problem with all this, is it's just we're trying to guess and hope for the best.
Yeah. Tom?
Yeah, Nadine, could you just give us a time check? Because I'm bumped up against other obligations.
Yes. No, we're actually way over, and I kind of wanted to pull this together a little bit with selecting a date for our next meeting. I'm going to have to obviously skip on discussion of presentation to full board. I don't think we're ready to have that conversation yet. So I was looking at 2 weeks from today, the 13th. Can I get an indication from people if that's a doable date? Matt,
If you were to do it, would it be 9 AM again?
yeah,
Uh, Could it be 9:30?
it could be 9:30, if that would work better for you.
Yeah, I have an appointment that morning at 8:30, so if I had a little bit more time.
Okay, Jake,
I can make that work.
okay, Tom,
Yeah, that's fine.
Charlie,
I'm looking at Dean, go to somebody else and I'll get right back to
okay,
you.
Marie,
Yes.
Michael,
Yes.
Kim,
I would say yes for now, but it's also Martin Luther King weekend, I believe, so I am not 100%.
It is. Yeah.
Patrick.
You don't mind meeting on Friday the 13th? I don't.
Don Colburn,
Yes,
okay, and Colin, I think, is gone, so.
Yes, for me, Charlie.
Okay, great, Charlie, thank you. All right, so tentatively, we're gonna be at 9:30 on the 13th. If you can make it, great. Public comment, I haven't even acknowledged anybody in the attendees. Anybody in the attendee side have any comments? Questions? Okay, I see no hands going up. So with that said, I'll take a motion to adjourn.
Make the motion.
Second,
Second.
thank you. Without objection, I will adjourn this meeting.
Thanks, Nadine.